Hello, this is Ben. Today we're going to look at volumetrics and volumetric nodes in Blender version 2.7, which has introduced some new volume shaders to the Blender workflow. So I've got a basic beginning project file here for Blender. Let me delete my camera and my light. We're not going to need those. I like to have this little window down here where I can run cycles. Keeps the CPU low, but allows me to see what I'm doing. Especially important when you're doing something like volumetrics because you can't see it in any windows other than the render window, at least as far as I know. Okay, so let's set up this top layer to be the node window. I apologize for not showing my hotkeys. The plug-in screencast keys doesn't work very well with cycles. It starts to get all buggy when you turn on the cycles view, so I'm just going to keep it off. All right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to get my cube in position. So let me go into edit mode and move this up 1 pixel so that it's sitting right on the ground. That way if I scale it here, it will keep itself on the ground. So that's kind of useful. Control A to apply the scale. I will make a plane and make it nice and big, so I don't have to worry too much about the edges, but I can cast some shadows if I need to. Let me make a couple of lights. Mesh plane, just move these there. And that'll be one, and I'll move another one maybe here. Maybe I'll make this one my key light. So I will give it an emit node, set it to have a power of, let's say, 25. Now would be a good time to turn on cycles, by the way. 35. And now the other light will also be emit. But this one will have a power of maybe 5, but I'm going to scale it up a lot so it has kind of softer light. Ooh, actually, I kind of like that as key, don't I? I sure do. I almost want to make it a little blue. Feels like it's coming from outside. And maybe make the other one a little more yellow. Feels like it's coming from inside. And I'll keep it at that. I am going to go into my sampling settings and turn up my preview to maybe 50. Okay. And that's just going to make the quality a little bit nicer. I won't worry about any other settings for now. Okay. There's our setup. Now from here on out, we're mostly working with the cube. So my cube has a material. It's just a basic diffuse color. I could change the color and it'd do that. But the material output has 3 outputs: surface, volume, and displacement. We mostly worry about surface, at least to this point in cycles. Surface basically means when a light beam comes into the cube, the surface is going to do a few things. It's either going to say bounce it off, or bounce some of it off and let some of it come in and go through. But whatever it's going to do, it happens exactly at the moment where it hits the surface. As soon as it passes through the surface and it's inside the cube, it just goes in a straight line. And its characteristic doesn't change until it hits the other side of the mesh, if there is another side of the mesh. And then it does something else. It bends, it shoots off a different direction, changes maybe its color a little bit, does stuff like that. Volume doesn't care about the outside surface at all. It completely ignores it, except for the fact that nothing that you set in volume can happen outside of the mesh. The mesh basically acts like boundaries for where the volume can have its influence. But you don't even need a surface for the volume to work. So I'm going to delete the surface. Now it's all black because when the light hits it, it says, what should I do? Surface, surface says nothing. What should I do? Volume, volume says nothing, and so forth. So it just comes back black, or comes back null, has no answer. Well, let's go ahead and add a volume shader, shall we? Shader, volume scatter. Plug that into volume, and look, I get a cloud. And the cloud's even casting a shadow. Isn't that great? That's terrific. The big setting for volume that you'll play with a lot, I think, is density. Notice right now density is 1. If I move the density up, it becomes, well, more dense, becomes more thick inside. The cloud gets more dense. That's a good way to think about it, is that cloud. So I'm going to set this maybe around 50, just for fun. And then let's look at a texture that we can apply to this. So I'm going to go texture, and I'll choose Voronoi. Voronoi, as I sometimes hear it called. I kind of go back and forth between the two of them depending on how French I'm feeling that day, even though I'm sure it's actually not French. And then I'm going to add a texture coordinate just for good measure, and I'm going to use an object texture coordinate. What that means is I can edit the mesh all I want, and it's not going to change the dimensions of the texture inside my volume. If I use generated kind of, I don't know if it uses a bounding box or some kind of convex hull measurement, but if you mess with the mesh in edit mode, it will change how your textures sit in there. And I don't like that most of the time, so I like to use object, which only moves the textures if you're moving the whole object in object mode. I find that gives me more flexibility. I'm going to take the FAC, okay, the factor, which is a black and white representation between 0 and 1, output of the Voronoi texture, and put it into density. And I get that. Isn't that beautiful? No, it's not beautiful at all. It doesn't make any sense. Well, let me make the number a bit lower. That'll make Voronoi be a bit easier to see, but not a lot easier to see. Voronoi is basically a bunch of little spheres floating out in space, kind of randomly arranged. But the trick is that these spheres don't have hard boundaries between where the sphere starts and where the sphere ends. It's kind of a gradient transition between the center of the sphere and the outside of the sphere and moving on to the next sphere. So what we need to do is find some way to tighten up those boundaries. So we're going to use a math node here. Convert math, pop it in here, and we are going to use the less than math node. Okay, what that does is if I set this to be 1, it says anytime the output of Voronoi texture, which is between 0 and 1, anytime it's less than 1, output 1. And you can see it's completely solid because everything is less than 1 for the most part. If I set 0, nothing is less than 0 because it's ranged between 0 and 1. So it comes out nothing, except for this nasty square, which also happened in Smoke sometimes. You just need to make sure that your plane is not perfectly intersecting with the cube. And right now it is. You can see it kind of struggling there. So with my cube selected, I'm going to move it up just a teeny bit on the in the z-axis. Now it's not going to be casting any strange shadows, but it still looks like it's sitting on the floor. So that's how you get around that. Okay, back to our nodes now. Now, instead of going from 0 to 1, let's try something in the middle. You've probably already thought of this. You probably already tried it while I was doing the other stuff. Let's try 0.5. Well, that sure is kind of interesting. Let's try a smaller number, 0.2. Oh, now we're looking about the same as we ever looked here. Let's try 0.1. Well, it still works, but it's not, I don't know. Now, what you need to realize is that the density, again, let me just go back to what we had originally. When the density is 1, it looks kind of squishy all over the place, like a fairly porous sponge. If I up the density to, say, 70, it looks quite solid. Now, the output of this is between 0 and 1. So what I'm going to do is come up with another math node that can, instead of going from 0 to 1, it'll go from, let's say, 0 to 50. You do that with multiply. Multiply it by 50. Look at that. Ah, now we're starting to get somewhere, I think. It's still a little strange, but we're starting to get somewhere. So here I'm going where the value is 0, I get 0, and where the value is basically where we're getting less than 0.1 coming out of the Voronoi texture, it gives us 50. Okay, so it's nice and thick where that happens. These are still, they're pretty small, so I'm going to go into my scale and make the scale smaller, which makes the dots larger. 0.5, let's try 0.2, it's a bit much, 0.3, that, 0.35. That's it. I'm just going to stop there. 0.35 is it. So now we've got these spheres floating out in space. Now, in order to distinguish between the spheres and the ground, I'm going to add a material for the ground. Make it, I don't know, give it a color that lets it stand out, even if just a little. I'm just a fan of cyan these days. I'm going to go kind of cyanish. And then our volume, we're going to give our volume a color. It's not, I have a hard time predicting exactly how it's going to turn out, but it's it's interesting. What you get is almost always interesting, and you usually get a variety of colors. So I'm going to move just a little bit into the red spectrum. I'm going to turn the saturation way down, and I get this kind of bizarre looking color gradient that happens. I'm sure someone knows why this is doing that. I don't entirely understand it. I know that volume is not the same as surfaces, even though it kind of looks like it right now. It's not. These are really, really tightly packed clouds, and they're going to interact with light differently than a surface would. Okay, so that's the basic of creating these little spheres in the volume using a Voronoi texture. Now, just let me just toggle between seeing the box. Here's the box. Okay, you can see the edges there. And here is the volume inside of it. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You're going to see these edges where the spheres get cut off. It's not because the Voronoi texture is doing that, but because we're hitting the boundary. Like, for instance, with this sphere here on the left that gets kind of dark, that's the boundary of the wall there. And so it just doesn't have anywhere else to go. Because I'm using an object texture coordinate, I could go into edit mode and scale this, and then it would give me more, hopefully that makes sense. So, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to focus on what's sitting here for now, I think. Okay, that's the first part. Just setting up and creating that. There we go. Voila, perfect, excellent, lovely. Now I've got my material here. I'm going to do a little extra work. I've got my shader node and my material output, very important. I've got nothing in surface, so the surface is completely invisible, but the volume has something to give, so it doesn't come up black. This controls my density, and now I have my less than. This controls the width of the sphere, remember? So if instead of being 0.1, I make it 0.13, the sphere gets bigger. 0.2, the sphere gets even larger. If I do 0.05, the sphere gets much smaller. Well, what I'm going to do is duplicate this, and instead of being 0.1, I'll give it the same input, I'm going to make it 0.8. So you can probably guess, I'm sorry, not 0.8, 0.08, a little bit smaller. And if I plug that in to the multiply node, which is controlling the density, the spheres get a little bit smaller. Okay, well this, I can use this to my advantage. What I can do is I can create another math node and set this one to subtract. Go ahead and put that in the input. Right now it will give me nothing. And if I plug in the larger sphere and say I'm going to subtract 0 from the larger sphere, nothing happens. But if I tell it to subtract the smaller sphere from the larger sphere, I get this. I get hollow spheres, basically. Some of them, again, are cut out because they get to the edge of the wall, which is frankly pretty interesting anyways to see that. So I get these little, I don't know what they are. They look like we used to call them China balls. They'd wash up on the coast in Washington State where I grew up. They're pretty cool, these little glass balls that were used with fishnets and stuff. And we used to collect them. There weren't very many out there, but you could find them if you looked around, the China balls. So we got these little China balls here. There we go, and I can try increasing my density a bit and say, oh, wow, but look, these guys go black. If I get them too dense, they're just not going to work. So I'm going to go back down to 50. Let me add one more of these. And this one, same inputs, I'm going to make it much smaller. Instead of 0.08, it's going to be 0.02 maybe. I'm going to replace that in my density controller. And now I've got these nice little dots, maybe even smaller, 0.015. Okay, well, how can I use that? Well, instead of subtracting, I can also add these things together. So let me duplicate that and instead go to add. Okay. So if I add this top value, which is these are my hollow spheres, if I add those to 0, I get the hollow spheres, okay? But if I add those to my tiny spheres, I get hollow spheres with tiny spheres in the middle. Isn't that exciting? Sure is. Now, there's an option in your render settings called volume sampling. And an important option in here is the step size option, 0.10. Anyone who's played around with volume settings previously when it was quite experimental has definitely fiddled with this. The smaller it is, the more detail you get. That's really the bulk of the spacing between the dots that you see in here is coming from the step size, at least as I understand it. So I'm going to go from 0.1 to 0.01 and notice the difference. They seem thicker, although they're not actually thicker, but it's putting in a lot more dots. It's responding to that density slider with a lot more precision, I suppose. So that's pretty interesting. It also takes a lot longer. If I did 0.001, it is chugging along very slowly, very slowly. And but that's okay. You can, for your final render, if this is what you're looking for, you can fiddle around with this, and see the general look of it, and then say, all right, that's good, and then do your big expensive render with the setting where you want it. For now, I'm going to set this to be 0.05, which is about half the quality, maybe 0.025. That's a little better than 0.1. Not a lot, gosh. No. I'm going to go 0.01. I think we can handle it. 0.01. Okay, so that's the basics of how you could take a texture like the Voronoi texture. And let me just run through this again. So here is my texture coordinate applied to the Voronoi texture, which I've set a scale that I'm happy with to create a set of floating spheres. Is how the texture works in 3D space. Now I've plugged those into less than math nodes. I could use something other than that. I could use greater than. You can use a color ramp and just kind of tighten in the values so there's a really sharp transition between white and black. That works as well. But I'm using less than. This top one denotes the largest sphere, and the middle one denotes a slightly smaller sphere, and I'm subtracting the slightly smaller sphere from the largest sphere, which gives me the hollow sphere. Okay. And I'm also creating a very small sphere, which I am adding to the hollow sphere to create a sphere with a sphere inside of it. I'm piping that into a multiply node where I can control the density of the volume, basically how many little cloud specks or dust specks or whatever you want to call them are sitting in there. And that goes into my volume node where I have adjusted the color a little bit from absolute white to give it some interesting color effects, although I can't exactly explain to you why that happens. Okay, that's basically it, though. Let's try one more thing. Let's duplicate our volume and our density controller, which is the multiply node. And let me plug that in. And I'm going to run I'm going to run the small sphere into that multiply density controller. And I'm just going to delete, Control X delete, my add node, which deletes it and lets that link continue. Okay, so now, as you can see, I've just disconnected my hollow sphere here. I've set them on separate pathways. I'm going to adjust the color a bit to be something else. Let's see. Ooh, look at that, a nice blue color. Maybe a darker, kind of saturated blue color. Yeah, it's really pretty. Turn down the saturation a bit. And maybe I want my density to be, these to be really, really dense, or reasonably dense. 100. They're going black, which is a bad sign. I wonder if I light these up, if I increase their intensity, if that makes a difference. I haven't actually tried this yet. Doesn't seem to matter. So, it may have to do with max steps. I'm not entirely sure at this point. I think I fiddled with that and haven't seen many results yet. So at a certain point, they start to go black and that's because you have too much density. I know it's that. I know it's related to density. So I'll go down to 75 here. And then let's look at the hollow spheres for a second. And I'm going to say these are too dense for what I want. So I am going to... And you'll notice they now don't have that center sphere inside of them. I'm going to bring down my density on these, maybe by half. So now I've got two different densities that I'm playing with, but I can't see them at the same time, except I can now create a mix shader. And now I do. Now one of the tricks here is that by using a mix shader, let me turn up my step size so it runs a bit faster. By using a mix shader, it seems to me like I'm losing maybe as much as half, since the factor is 0.5, of the density, because it's just giving half of it to it, which means I might want to be doubling my density. I'm not, someone's going to get on and correct me on this, because it's probably not how it works. But that's my superstition, at least. So now I'm able to have two different materials inside the volume, two different colors inside my volume, two different density settings, which I could have done anyways if you're following this pretty closely. There's ways to tweak that. And in a single volume input, or I suppose volume output here. So that's it. You can just play around with this stuff. You could change the thickness of your spheres, make them thicker, like that, or make them thinner, like that. You could animate these values. You could use a little formula to make the little purple balls inside, like undulate, get larger and smaller, things like that. So lots of stuff to play around with. So I hope you learned something here, and happy blendering.